When it comes to discussing some of the most influential games of all time, what comes to mind? Super Mario 64, Ocarina of Time, GTA 3, how about Wolfenstein? Or, even better, Doom. I've talked about Doom's impact in my Doom 3 video, but once again, it cannot be understated how important Doom is to video game culture as a whole. It solidified the FPS as a mainstay in the video game industry and was both critically and commercially successful. It single-handedly put id Software on the map, and after an equally well-received sequel, id had other plans to further expand on what Doom did and change the industry forever. And at the forefront of these plans was a little game called Quake. Originally teased all the way back in the Commander Keen days of id Software, years before Doom, Quake was an elusive and highly anticipated game all the way up until its release. At one point a fantasy RPG, over the course of the longest development time ever undertaken by id, the game changed and shifted many times before finally being released in 1996 to, well, a mixed reception. Its tech was undeniably impressive and it solidified itself in history for that alone, but as an actual game, it seemed like at the time people were kind of mixed on it. Outside of the people who wished the game was more like what it was originally intended to be, some felt that the game was too much like Doom and didn't innovate enough when it came to the gameplay. Even to this day, it seems like most people tend to talk about Quake more for its tech than the actual game itself, which in all honesty I find quite depressing because I think Quake is fucking fantastic. Sure, it didn't change the game as much with its actual gameplay in the way its predecessors did, but as a game on its own, removed from all of that, I think it's incredible. And this video is going to go into why exactly I think that, and what better place to start than the first episode. Now, before we get into that, I'm sure you are all wondering what exactly the story of Quake is. Well, you play as the Ranger, a man on a mission sent to destroy the Lovecraftian entity known as Quake. And yeah, it's as simple as that. Similarly to Doom, there is lore to this world that you can read up on, but the basic thrust is as simple as that, and it works perfectly fine for this kind of game. Back on track though, this first episode is honestly up there for me right next to Knee Deep in the Dead when it comes to classic FPS episodes. Despite starting out generic enough with the typical sci-fi corridors and grunt enemies you see in a lot of shooters, which is actually how every episode starts. Even during the first level of the first episode, you get a sense that something is off. The purple sky, the sickly greens and browns, it's all a little bit unsettling. As you progress, however, that feeling is all but confirmed, as you find yourself traversing through flooded mossy castles, rotten catacombs, and twisted cathedrals as the forces of a Lovecraftian entity seek to oppose you. As you delve even further into this twisted world, you enter a red and orange terracotta temple with striking stained glass windows, before falling into a twisted labyrinth straight out of Greek mythology. Each location is full of traps, perilous jumps, and secrets that keep you looking around every corner. Every location feels like the ransacked remains of a place that used to be recognizable, but under the influence of this cosmic evil, it's being twisted into these harsh, jagged shapes and abstract geometry. Back in my Doom 3 video, I talked about how the original two Doom games are, to me at least, the earliest examples of games having a true sense of atmosphere and immersion. And of course I do still agree with that statement, but Quake? It's on a whole nother level. If Doom 1 and 2 laid the foundation for immersion in games, then Quake built upon it in all the right places, and to me, stands the test of time because of it. This game is still atmospheric and immersive to this day, and this is coming from someone who only played the game fairly recently when it was remastered and released on current day consoles. There's a whole new level of verticality to the locations, and a lot more creative stuff can happen when it comes to traps and shifting platforms that really makes these levels feel different from Doom and a step up in my opinion. The phenomenal soundtrack courtesy of industrial rock band 9 Inch Nails is also perfect for setting the mood and one of my favorite video game soundtracks of all time. It's so effective at whisking you away and fantastically conveys the darkness and horror of Quake and its world. It's such a key component of Quake and deserves all the praise in the world. On top of that, you also have a fantastic roster of enemies introduced in the first episode. You start off with the aforementioned generic grunts and Rottweiler dogs to kind of start things off, but as you progress further in into the episode and further into the other world, the enemies get more deranged, twisted, and horrifying, starting out with the ogre. Described as an 8-foot tall cannibalistic monster in the manual, the ogre is one of the first threats you ever run into, and they come equipped with a chainsaw hand that can do lethal damage at close range, and have the ability to throw high damaging grenades, making them a threat throughout the entire game, not just in those first few early levels. I also really like their design, like with pretty much every other monster in Quake, although I did originally think that they had sacks on their heads, kind of as a homage to Leatherface or Jason Voorhees? Jason Voorhees in Friday the 13th Part 2. But of course that isn't the case, they just have ogre faces, which is, well, appropriate. The Ash Williams chainsaw hand though makes up for it. You also, appropriately enough I might add, end up running into these zombified knights as you make your way further into the castles and dungeons of Quake. They're quick and deadly in groups and can often ambush you out of nowhere, and when you get your hands on some explosives can end up rushing you and causing you to blow yourself up by mistake. The fiends do this as well, but with triple the health and a pants-shittingly terrifying pounce attack that can do some serious damage. The fiends are one of the tougher enemies throughout the entire game, and in packs it's pretty much game over. For a change from melee-focused enemies, let's have a look at the Scrags. One of the most unique designs in the game, these fleshy snake-human hybrids ominously float around open areas and spit acid projectiles. They're similar to the cacodemons from Doom, but they're just a lot faster, and with the added verticality of Quake, they do act a little bit differently than cacodemons would. You also have zombies, who are one of the more unique enemy types in the game. They're completely indestructible except against explosive damage. This makes them one of the only enemies where you really need to think about what weapon you're going to use against them, and it's at the very least the first time something like this showed up in an id first-person shooter. The most challenging enemy you encounter in episode 1 though, and arguably throughout the entire game, is the Shambler. High health with a high damaging lock-on attack, the Shambler will remain a massive threat throughout the entire game, and it's probably the most iconic monster from Quake 1. I cannot imagine how terrifying seeing one of these things for the first time would have been back in 1996. Even to this day, seeing one poke around a corner makes my heart skip a beat. I can't say the same for the final boss of episode 1 though, Chthon. It's pretty easy, unfortunately. I like his visual design though, I guess. But you know what else I kind of like, I guess? It's gun. We're talking about guns next. You start out with a shotgun because obviously id learned that no one uses the pistol, so you might as well give the player the de facto primary weapon in most classic FPS games. And of course it comes with a lower fire rate but higher damaging variant, as was enforced by law at the time. You also get a nail gun with its ammo crates having the 9-inch nails logo on them because why not? I think the nail gun and its super variant are probably my favourite weapons in the entire game. I love that they're actually physical projectiles, kind of like Doom's plasma rifle, and I absolutely love hosing enemies down with them, and the super variant is even more punchy and satisfying to use, even if it does burn through ammo insanely fast to compensate for that. You also have a grenade launcher and rocket launcher for explosive options, with the grenade launcher functioning like nothing else in any other id game previously, with how you can ricochet grenades off of walls and around corners to kill enemies. The rocket launcher though is special. On its own it's basically just the Doom rocket launcher in 3D with fast moving projectiles, but to those unfamiliar with the Quake rocket launcher, it gave birth to an entirely new way of moving around video games, the rocket jump. Yes, Quake is in fact the origin for one of the most ubiquitous things in a lot of competitive multiplayer games like Team Fortress 2. I'm honestly confident in saying that outside of Doom 2's Super Shotgun, it's the most influential gun ever introduced into a video game, with just how much of an impact it had on the multiplayer space. I do agree with some criticisms though that the weapon roster is a little too similar to Doom, even if it's all fun to use. Like outside of the nail guns, grenade launcher, and a weapon we'll get to later, they all feel like they're ripped straight from Doom, which is a bit of a shame. Maybe a crossbow or hunting rifle could have leaned into the more rustic aesthetic of Quake. It's hard to say, but I still think the shotguns are pretty fitting regardless. So wrapping up episode 1 of Quake, it's some of the best classic FPS action you could ask for, and in combination with its fantastic music, sound design, enemies, locations, and atmosphere, it makes for an experience that is a worthy successor to Doom. Sure, it isn't the ambitious fantasy RPG that was originally envisioned, but on its own, it's an almost flawless, fast-paced, exciting, timeless set of levels that really show that Quake means business. The only real complaint I have is that it introduces you to a lot of what the game has to offer in terms of its enemies and weapons, and I think it could have been spread out a little more equally over the episodes, but I also understand that for a first episode you want to reel people in, so it really isn't that major of an issue, and I still love this episode. But the question is, can Quake keep up this momentum into its next few episodes? Well, the only way to find out is to dive straight into it, starting with episode 2. Within episode 2, we find ourselves traversing abstract cathedrals and dark keeps, with the colour palette being a little bit more vibrant, including more blues, purples, and yellows. Don't get me wrong, it's still drab and muted, but it helps set these areas apart a little bit more from episode 1, which was mostly greens and browns. Once again, the music is fantastic, but I'll quit mentioning it from now on just because I'll sound like a broken record. We also see a lot of wooden floors, beams, as well as a lot more moving parts and contraptions, almost like you're navigating through a giant medieval siege tower. It's a really unique aesthetic, and it reminds me a lot of steampunk, but perhaps a more primitive version of it. The levels themselves are longer than in episode 1 and a tad more difficult, at least for me, although I can still get through them without too much trouble. Speaking of trouble though, episode 2 introduces some new monsters to the Quake roster. First off, we have the Enforcers, slightly buffed grunts with a laser weapon that add a nice bit of variety to those opening sci-fi levels. They're not too much trouble on their own, but in groups they can do some serious damage, and they at the very least add a little bit of variety to those sci-fi levels. You also have the Death Knights, who, although basically just being a beefed up version of the standard knight, set themselves apart with their great design and this bullet-held projectile that can really fuck you over if you're not careful. The king of fucking you over though is the spindly human-spider hybrid abomination thing called the Vor. The Vor is one of the most deadly enemies in the entire game, with an insanely high damaging homing projectile that is insanely hard to shake off to an almost infuriating degree. They are only introduced at the very end of episode 2 but become prominent in the following episodes, and I always try to kill them first no matter what. Although even when it's dead, its projectile can still follow you and kill you in a display of true Lovecraftian evil. There's also a fish, and I mean it's just a fish. It's a zombie fish, but it's mostly just a fish, so moving on. For as deadly as those new enemies are though, you have one new weapon to help you in this regard, the Thunderbolt. The Thunderbolt basically lets you roleplay as a shambler with a highly damaging, highly accurate beam that can just tear through enemies. Ammo is particularly scarce, however, so choosing when not to use it is equally as important as choosing when to use it. Also, don't fire it when you're in the water. Trust me. Overall, episode 2 gives you more of what you liked from episode 1, with a few new things on top. I do wish it was a little more different in terms of the aesthetics though. Like previously mentioned, it does include some variations in the color palette, but especially in the early levels, it's a lot of the similar greens and browns that you saw in episode 1. And I would have liked it if it distinguished itself a little bit earlier on. That's such a minor complaint though, and everything remains as fun as episode 1, and all the good I had to say back there applies here as well. Next up on our journey through Quake though is episode 3. This episode reminds me most of Doom, and more specifically Doom 64 with its locations and aesthetics. Pools of lava, harsh metallic corridors, skulls lining the walls and doors, satanic imagery, it's all eerily familiar. It's all still good stuff of course, and there is one level that is an exception to this, which is the wind tunnels, which have this really interesting gimmick of, well, the wind tunnels themselves. That level in particular reminded me a lot of the gimmick levels that you saw in Doom 1 and 2. Something like Barrels of Fun, which has a core gimmick to it which sets it apart from the others. And I'm not saying gimmicky in a derogatory way, because a lot of these gimmick levels are actually some of the funnest in all of these games. In terms of difficulty, episode 3 definitely takes it up a notch, and the bridge and Chambers of Torment is really an apt example of this. More enemies being teleported in more frequently, and with the Vors now becoming a mainstay of the roster, combat encounters are more challenging overall, although I do enjoy this jump in difficulty. I will say though, I think episode 3 is probably my least favorite episode from Vanilla Quake. It's still a ton of fun, don't get me wrong, and more of the Quake action I love, but outside of the final level, the level design didn't really jump out to me that much in comparison to the other episodes. And I think its Doom adjacent aesthetic doesn't appeal to me as much as the medieval castles and cathedrals Quake is known for. Comparing directly with episode 2, it also doesn't introduce anything new that we haven't seen before. That isn't too big of a deal for me personally, but it's just something to take into account when comparing the different episodes. Overall though, episode 3 is still great fun, and although I think it's the weakest one, the bar is so high that I enjoyed my time with it regardless. Finally though, we have the 4th and final episode of Quake. To me, episode 4 feels like the culmination of everything leading up to this point, and that goes for the aesthetics as well. It's the most scattershot and abstract looking episode in Quake, with easily the most varied color palette and interesting look. I think this look is fantastic, and some of my favorite visuals in all of Quake show up in this episode. It also has probably my favorite level of Quake, that being the Pain Maze, with its visuals reminding me a lot of Alice in Wonderland to some extent. Each room feels distinct and is full of color, but in a way that feels distinctly Quake and still a bit ominous. The level is certainly challenging, but a whole lot of fun, and it does elevate the episode as a whole for me quite a bit because of how much I adore this level and its vibe. Saying all that though, the rest of the episode is still great fun to play and really visually interesting, with a lot of elements from all of the previous episodes combined together. It also plays a lot more with lighting than any of the previous episodes, which in some places actually adds to the difficulty. The main thing that adds to the difficulty though is the new enemy type introduced in episode 4, the Spawn. The Spawn are probably the most universally hated enemy in all of Quake. They're fast as hell, do a lot of damage, have a kamikaze attack, and can really hide well in the shadows and corners of rooms. When I played Quake for the first time, I remember these things causing me insane amounts of trouble, and that's purely because of how they force you to play the game differently. You have to be much slower and more tactical when taking on the Spawn, with corner peeking and some grenade ricocheting being essential. It really shakes things up so late in the game, and I think they're a great inclusion, even if they can be frustrating at times. Overall, episode 4, although definitely scattershot in certain respects, is a fantastic selection of levels that brings together so many elements from previous episodes while shaking things up with its unique level layouts and heightened difficulty. I truly do rate it highly, and I think that it's a great final set of levels, although it isn't exactly the end of the journey. Yes, although we have fought back the forces of Quake, as long as it exists, the universe shall remain in danger. As the Ranger prepares himself for the final battle, we plunge into the lair of this cosmic terror and attempt to destroy it in all its horrifying glory. I beat it. Yeah, I beat it, watch. Okay, to be honest, when I first played this boss, it was the hardest part of the game for me. I just kept messing up the timing and was constantly killed by the countless Vors and Shamblers. Once you figure it out though, it is a little underwhelming, but then again, the idea of telefragging an ancient eldritch deity is fucking awesome. Despite this being where...
Shub Niggurath. Shub Niggurath.
Yeah, dies. Post-release, 2 additional mission packs were introduced, called Scourge of Armagon and Dissolution of Eternity, respectively. The first of these was Scourge of Armagon, which was developed by Hypnotic Software, later known as Ritual Entertainment. They're most well known for their work on the Sin series, Counter-Strike Condition Zero, Legacy of Kain Defiance, and Star Trek Elite Force 2. Scourge of Armagon was released on the 5th of March 1997, a little under a year after the base game, and comes with 3 episodes: Fortress of the Dead, Dominion of Darkness, and The Rift. Each episode has a primary theme, and these themes are actually something that is in Vanilla Quake, but I haven't mentioned up to this point. The 3 main level themes in Vanilla Quake are Base, Medieval, and Runic. Base is what you see in early levels of Quake and in Episode 1 of Scourge of Armagon, a dingy, gritty sci-fi setting that's usually populated with grunts, enforcers, and Rottweilers. It's your typical sci-fi space marine type of affair. Medieval is what you see most throughout Vanilla Quake and during Episode 2 of Scourge of Armagon. Castles, dungeons, temples, and caverns in dark browns, greens, and blues. It's my personal favorite level theme, and it's the one that's primarily used in Dominion of Darkness. Then finally you have Runic. It's the level theme most comparable to Doom's style, and is seen throughout Episode 3 of both Scourge of Armagon and Vanilla Quake. I should point out though that there is a lot of theme mixing throughout Quake, so when I say a certain level or episode has a theme, what I really mean is that the theme it's using is just the one that it uses primarily, not the only one it uses. Because of the Scourge of Armagon episodes having a primary theme, for me at least, Episode 1 is my least favorite episode of Quake, including Vanilla and all the add-ons. add-ons. And that's simply just because the base level theme is probably the least interesting to me, especially compared to Runic and Medieval, which are a lot more varied. Some things are done to shake it up though, like more environmental hazards and traps, as well as a new enemy type called the Centroid, which is basically a robot scorpion with nail guns, which is pretty cool. But overall, I'm not the biggest fan of this episode. The laser cannon is a ton of fun to use though, with its ricocheting projectiles that devastate enemies in closed interiors, so that is a plus. Next up though is episode 2, Dominion of Darkness, which is my favorite episode of this mission pack. It's full of castles, caves, dungeons, and large-scale medieval traps, with my personal favourite level probably being the Catacombs, which has this really neat underground castle with a working drawbridge and a moat of lava. We also get introduced to 2 new enemies in this episode, the Gremlins and the Spike Mine. The Gremlins are these weird wolfmen things that supposedly have the ability to take your weapons from you, but I honestly didn't see that happen at all whilst playing, so they felt a little pointless. It's a nice gimmick to have some unique enemies, but they didn't shake up encounters in the way even the Centaur did, so I was a little disappointed to see how underwhelming they were. The spike mines are similarly middling, with them essentially just being projectiles with an insta-kill explosive attack. Similarly to the Gremlins, they don't really shake up combat encounters that much, so I don't really know why they're here in the first place. We do get a new weapon introduced in this episode though, called the Proximity Mine Launcher, which does exactly what you'd expect, turning grenades into mines. It works well enough, but the main issue is that because of the fast pace of Quake gameplay, you can't really set a trap with them since you rarely get a moment to strategize, meaning I really didn't use it that much at all. The rest of this episode though is decent fun, and although not quite as strong as vanilla Quake, I still had a good time, and it alone is worth giving Scourge of Armagon a go. The final episode though is The Rift, which is pretty solid overall and on a similar level of quality to Dominion of Darkness. I just personally prefer episode 2's medieval level theme. 3 does end with a boss fight as well, although it does kind of follow in the tradition of Quake boss fights, if you know what I mean. Overall, although a decent time, Scourge of Armagon isn't my favourite Quake thing ever. And it isn't just because of the things I've mentioned previously, but also a problem with most of the levels, which is navigation. I'm not sure why, but for me at least, these levels were a lot more of a nuisance to navigate. Generally, I don't have a great sense of direction, but I didn't find myself getting super lost in vanilla Quake, so I'm not sure if it's just me or something to do with the design of the levels in Scourge of Armagon. Let me know in the comments. The soundtrack was also much weaker, in my opinion. Still decent, but it was a lot of Doom-style guitars, which is fine, but I much prefer the atmospheric, industrial, ambient tones of the vanilla game's OST, and it's nowhere near as immersive or unique in my opinion. That, combined with the weaker first episode and some of the mixed new additions, makes Scourge of Armagon on the weaker end of Quake 1 content, which just goes to show how high quality the rest of Quake is, if this pretty fun collection of levels is one of the weaker parts of it. Moving on to the next mission pack though, the Rogue Entertainment developed Dissolution of Eternity was released only 2 weeks after Scourge of Armagon on the 19th of March 1997. Rogue Entertainment are probably best known for Strife and American McGee's Alice, but would later become Nerve Software, and act as assistant developers on Return to Castle Wolfenstein and almost every Call of Duty game from 2010 to 2018. And let me tell you, they did a really great job with this mission pack. Parts of it feel id levels of quality, and there's so much to love here. Episode 1 feels like a best-of collection of Quake levels with all the castles, catacombs, temples, and caves you could ask for. It has a great mix of medieval and runic level themes, and it's all done really well and feels like a natural extension of vanilla Quake. A few areas reminded me of Blood and even Event Horizon, oddly enough. The pack also adds some new items and enemies into the game. For the latter, you have electric eels, disembodied swords, ogres that fire multiple grenades, and these Grim Reaper looking dudes who are basically just flying faster but less damaging Vors. In terms of weapons, you also have lava-tipped nails which affect your super nail gun and your regular nail gun. These increase damage, although they are a lot harder to find than just the regular nails. In addition, you also have a multi-grenade launcher and a multi-rocket launcher. And as the names suggest, the multi-grenade launcher shoots multiple grenades, and the multi-rocket launcher shoots multiple rockets. I'll admit that these additions aren't too game-changing, but I still appreciate them being added in, and I think a lot of them are really cool. You even get a unique boss fight with a beefed-up version of the Grim Reapers, and it's actually an okay boss. That really isn't saying much for Quake standards, but hey, I did die once or twice, so that's something. Episode 1 is great, and Episode 2 is equally as great, with a wide variety of locations from ancient Greece to Egyptian catacombs to Aztec temples. There are a ton of unique and impressive set pieces and tons of unique enemies to the stages. For example, at the end of the aforementioned Greek, Egyptian, and Aztec stages, you get unique looking sub-bosses that reflect their culture. The Greek level even has a really cool statue enemy that stays still until triggered by a specific event, and they only show up in this one Greek level. You also have a level that has a fire demon boss, and another level that has a really awesome boss that I don't want to spoil, just because it was one of the few times where I've actually audibly said what the fuck when playing a game, so I don't want to spoil that. I know this is brief, but there really isn't much more to say with Dissolution of Eternity. It's just great fun. It's creative and visually striking, with great levels and tons of surprises thrown in, so what's not to love? Sure, the music isn't vanilla Quake levels of quality, and the levels can drag on a bit, but it's still well worth checking out and a ton of fun. After these 2 mission packs though, there was no official extra content for Quake for almost 20 years, until Machine Games released the mission packs Dimension of the Past in 2016 and Dimension of the Machine in 2021. Dimension of the Past was the first of these mission packs to release, and is a simple enough collection of levels with an emphasis on heightened difficulty. Other than the pretty well done atmosphere in places, it's as simple as can be, and pretty stripped back with no additional enemies or items added. I'll be honest and say that, although I did enjoy the atmosphere initially, in terms of aesthetics, the pack doesn't really change much, so it got a little bit samey and bland by the end. Quake is pretty dark and drab, yes, but it does use a variety of colors to make the levels stand out more visually, but still manages to make them atmospheric and fit into the world of Quake. It's definitely a hard balance to strike, but for me the pack was just a little bit too brown and dingy, which would have been good for a level or two, but not the whole thing. I did marathon all these mission packs back to back though, so that could have contributed to it as well. Overall, it's fine if you want a challenge, I suppose, but things really get interesting with Dimension of the Machine, the mission pack they created specifically for the remaster. I mean, just look at this hub world. It's incredible what a game from 20 plus years ago can look like when pushed to its absolute limit. The lighting, the textures, the sound, the ambiance, it all just works perfectly. With the visuals alone, this pack is worth playing through, and it maintains this stunning and immersive presentation throughout its duration. Each level had a distinct vibe and aesthetic, and it was just an absolute marvel to walk through and experience. There's so much visual variety in the settings and locations, and I honestly don't want to show too much because there's so many great surprises in each level. There were genuinely times when I just had to stop and take it all in. It looks so good, and I know it's still retro and blocky, but it just works for me and has 10 times more personality and is 10 times more immersive than a lot of bigger budget, better tech games out there. There are so many impressive set pieces and creative things done with a game that's almost 30 years old, and I think that's incredible. Even past the visual aspect, this to me feels like the definitive final chapter of Quake 1, with the heightened difficulty really testing how well you know that original game and how well you've mastered it. Sure, there's no new weapons or enemies, but with level design this polished and visuals with this much love put into them, it's well worth it. In my opinion, Dimension of the Machine blows Dimension of the Past out of the water. Not only does Dimension of the Machine match Dimension of the Past's difficulty level, but it's also a million times better to look at. It's clear that no expense was spared when it came to Dimension of the Machine, and I can't be more happy with how it turned out. I wish I could say more, but I really don't want to spoil it since it's relatively recent, and I'm sure there's some people who played the original game all the way back in the day who didn't even know this got released. If you're in that boat, I really recommend you give it a try. It makes you see the world of Quake in a whole new way, and it's a really good challenge for people who are familiar with that original game. And speaking of that original game and everything I've talked about today, I just want to say that Quake is fucking incredible. Even with weak bosses, and perhaps not the innovation gameplay-wise people had hoped for, Quake is a fantastic game with a fantastic world, evolved and even better Doom-style gameplay, a brilliant enemy roster, a fantastic soundtrack, and an atmosphere that kept its hooks in me long after playing, and I highly recommend you give the remaster that was released in 2021 a go. It comes with everything I've talked about today, as well as a ton of add-on content directly from the community, giving you dozens and dozens of hours of content well worth the price. With all that being said then, you can imagine my excitement when I realized that Quake 2 had also been given a remaster recently this year, with me instantly buying the game as soon as I saw it on the PlayStation Store. Other than a few screenshots, I had no idea what to expect, and it's safe to say that I was anxiously awaiting for the game to finish installing, and when it did just that, I immediately jumped into the campaign. Immediately I was surprised to see some actual story describing a war between humans and aliens called the Strogg. Okay, pretty interesting way to start. Maybe the aliens are from the other world or kind of in league with the other world, who's to say, so let's just jump straight into it. Okay, standard sci-fi level, the way every Quake episode starts, looking good so far. Okay, let's get to the next level. A little janky, but I do like seamlessly transitioning into the next level, that works really well. I wonder when we'll get to the other world though. Okay, another level, we should be getting close now, right? Right? Then it hit me. We're never going to the other world, are we? Yes, in case you are unaware, Quake 2 has nothing to do with the story and world of Quake 1. Quake 2 is basically if you just took the base sci-fi level theme from Quake 1 and stretched it over the course of an entire game. Now, don't get me wrong, Quake 2 has a lot of good things about it. It's even more impressive tech-wise than the original, it's fun to play, and the weapons feel and sound great. It's much more cinematic and has a lot more production value than Quake 1, but none of that matters to me when the world just didn't grip me whatsoever. The enemies mostly look the same, the locations all look the same, it's the same generic sci-fi action plot you've seen a million times, and it just got repetitive after a while. Even the music, although definitely decent, just feels like it belongs in Doom or any other high-octane shooter that isn't Quake. For as much as I would have liked a sequel to Quake to be faithful, I wouldn't have minded some deviations if it made things interesting or unique, but it just doesn't. It's so clear to me that this was a completely different game during development, but then they decided to slap the Quake name onto it to bolster sales because why would it be so different otherwise? Even people who aren't the biggest fans of Quake 1 still concede that its world is fascinating, and outside of the tech, the Lovecraftian horror inspiration behind Quake is probably the most well-known thing about it. I guess people didn't mind too much though, because from Quake 2 onwards, the Quake series completely ditches Quake 1's identity and embraces the sci-fi angle of 2. Quake 3 goes even further away from Quake 1 by being a multiplayer arena shooter with no campaign whatsoever. And now, I'm not trying to say that one is objectively better than the other, because I'm sure these games are perfectly fine, but for me, it just seems like such a step down. Quake to me is about isolation, cosmic horror, dark fantasy, the abstract and the unexplainable. It's about persisting and testing your limits and reflexes as you wander through strange and haunting worlds. Quake 2, on the other hand, feels like it was made for the purposes of pushing the engine and showing off the tech. It lacks an identity, no level sticks out in my head. I can't think of a single time past the first level where I stopped and took in my surroundings the way I did in Quake 1. And once again, I'm not saying that Quake 2 is bad. It's decent, but is it gonna stay with me long after playing? I don't think so, at least not in the way that Quake 1 did. For as disappointed as I am that Quake 1 never really got a follow-up, at the very least, it's gotten a remaster that's accessible to a whole new potential audience of people. And the fact that Dimension of the Machine even happened shows that at the very least the people in charge know that there's still some interest in Quake 1. Even in recent years, it seems like an appreciation for Quake 1 has started to prop up, with videos from Civi11 and Ahoy pulling in millions of views. Hopefully this is some kind of indication that interest in Quake 1 is starting to ramp up, and I can only hope that a suit at Bethesda started to realize this. Listen, Bethesda, if you're watching this, ditch Quake Champions. Nobody cares what Quake Champions has got going on. Go back to the roots of Quake 1. Embrace the Lovecraftian horror. Embrace the twisted worlds. Maybe even go full-on survival horror or horror action. I'd love to see what can be done with the Quake world, especially with the tech that we have nowadays. But regardless of the future of the franchise, what I know to be true is that Quake 1 is a special kind of game. The atmosphere, the action, the level design, the concept, it all just works for me. Quake is an unapologetic celebration of horror, sci-fi, fantasy, and pulpy action films. And I think that all these elements come together in a way that makes Quake the ultimate triumphant love letter to all these genres. Everyone should give Quake a go at least once, even if you've seen its age and you worry that that might affect your experience. I used to think similarly, but as soon as I played it, I realized that this is a timeless game, and this is coming from somebody who was born years after it it first came out. And I can tell you that I will be coming back to Quake for years and years to come. With all that being said though, I'm Christian Cries, and thanks for watching. Hey everyone, this is the post-video discussion, and I actually have a specific thing that I want to talk about, but I couldn't manage to fit it into the video, and that is the logos. Now, I know that this seems like a completely unrelated rant, why are you talking about the logos, but it just bothered me. Okay, so I'm going to bring these up. Quake 1 has a terrific logo, one of the most iconic logos of all time. The fact that the cover of the game is just the logo shows how fucking iconic it is and how great it looks. So, what do you do when you do a sequel to Quake? Do you just keep the logo the same and just call it Quake 2? No, you do what Quake 2 did, and you make it Roman numerals, and you put an extra nail through that thing. Looks fantastic, even though I've always thought that the Quake, even though it's supposed to be a Q, I've always thought it looked more like a Y than a Q, but it still works. So Quake 2, whatever you want to say about it as a game, they got the logo right. Just add another nail through. But then, for Quake 3, you think there would be an obvious choice for the logo, right? You think, oh, okay, so they've done one nail through, they've done two nails through, let's do three nails through. But instead, they do this horrible thing. They take the logo, they turn it red, and then they, like, bend the thing around it. They have the one nail going through, which is now not a nail, it's like a little blade. And then they've got it like curving around, they've like turned it, they've bent it backwards. It just looks terrible and cheap. And it's like, you had the answer in front of you, which is to just do the crescent with the three nails going through, but they didn't even do that. And then don't even get me started on Quake 4. That is just, they didn't even try with Quake 4. And I get that 4 in Roman numerals would be really hard to do with the Quake logo, but you could just do what Black Ops 4 did. Sure, it didn't make any sense, but it looks much better than if you just did the regular Roman numerals. So just do that with the Quake logo. They literally don't try. The only difference between the Quake 4 logo and the Quake 1 logo is that there's like 4 little divots, I guess, like little bumps around it, which is like, is that even meant to symbolize that it's the fourth one, or is that just completely tangential? I don't know. Don't even get me started on Quake Champions, which is Quake 5, and they don't even change the logo at all. It's just the same old Quake logo, and it's like, the answer is obvious, right? You would just do two nails, making a V, which is obviously 5 in Roman numerals, and that would look sick, but they don't even bother with that. It's just the same old Quake logo. Dear Lord. Okay, damn, this was a completely pointless rant, but I had to get my logo rant out there, because there's no way I'm going to be able to say this in any other video. There's nobody I'm going to be able to talk about the Quake logo, so I might as well get it out here. But yeah, those are my thoughts on the Quake logos. Anyway, thank you for watching the video. Yeah, Quake's a good game. Timeless game. Love it. Like I said, I only played the remastered version, so I don't really know all the differences. So if you could tell me in the comments below if certain things were tweaked for the remaster, that would be great. But the remaster is the game that I fell in love with, and it's the game that I've played the most, or at least the version of Quake 1 that I've played the most, so that's what I've been talking about throughout this video. And yeah, I just love this game, and I love the world, and there's nothing really quite like it out there. So share your Quake love in the comments below. Let me know, are the other Quake games good? Because, you know, like I said, I'm sure they are decent, and although the fact that it isn't the Quake that I fell in love with anymore, the fact that it isn't that world, and the fact that it isn't, you know, the thing that I love about it, the fact that it isn't there anymore is deterring me. I'm sure that there are good games, and I have seen bits and pieces of Quake 4, and it has interested me a little bit, just because it seems like it's running on the same engine as it's running on the same engine as Doom 3, and obviously in my Doom 3 video I talk about how much I love the look of that game, so I feel like any game that runs on that engine I'm going to love the look of and the atmosphere of, but I know it's just going to be the Strog or whatever the hell, and not, you know, cool Lovecraftian shit in that engine, but, you know, it could still be cool, and I don't want to discount anybody's enjoyment of those games, because I'm assuming that the majority of Quake fans probably went into the series either through Quake 2 or Quake 3 or whatever else Quake, so they probably didn't even know that there was a Quake 1 that was completely different to the other games. So it's interesting, but just bizarre. It's bizarre that the series essentially had an established thing, and people said they liked it, and then they were just like, nah, we're doing a different thing actually. And people were kind of fine with it because those games sold well. It doesn't seem like there was much outrage around the changing of the theme, but you know, I'll always value Quake 1 as what it is, a insane mishmash of all these different elements, and and from what I've heard, it was a complete nightmare to develop, and that kind of explains the mishmashing of so many styles, just because level designers were like, fuck it, let's just throw this game together. Do we want a medieval thing? Do we want to do a, you know, like a red temple? Do we want to do all of this? Do we want to do a Doom thing? Let's just throw it all together. But I think that sort of inadvertently creates this idea of a super abstract and detached world. Even if it's completely unintentional, I think it's a fantastic bit of world building, and I just cannot wait to see, you know, what else there is for the Quake series. Hopefully it continues on from here, but if it doesn't, there's tons of mods for Quake 1, there's tons of fan add-ons and things like that, so I'll be content with that. And I just want to say thank you for watching and making it all the way. If you particularly enjoyed the video, you can support me on Coffee or Ko-fi or whatever you call it, and just send over $1 or $2. I really appreciate it. Subscribe for more content. I'm not sure what I'm going to do next, but I've got a few ideas. So anyway, thank you for watching. Subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, hit that bell, as the YouTuber influencers say. And yeah, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. And I love you guys, and thank you for all the support, and bye.